Paulette is the most well-known victim of Scientological abuse. She has borne the full brunt of Scientology's harassment toolkit, including harassing phone calls, lawsuits, attempts to frame, and public prosecution, infiltration, stalking and public humiliation. Even her boyfriend was a setup from Scientology. I have based the majority of this discussion on Paulette Cooper's own account. The link is to the right. So how did this story begin? In 1968, shortly after Paulette completed her master's degree in psychology, she found herself a struggling New York freelance writer. Paulette had done a summer course in comparative religion at Harvard, and her research on Scientology surprised her. She chose to do an investigative piece on Scientology, which was little known at the time. After a short investigation, Paulette wrote an article called "The Scandal of Scientology" for Queen magazine in the UK. After the piece was published, she had received a death threat. Paulette didn't think much of this, and so decided to expand her story into a book by the same name. It was published by Tower Publications in 1971. The book complained of e-meters having questionable results, Halbert had lied about his background, that Charles Manson had been a student of Scientology, that some auditors had behaved improperly, and detailed quotes from the report of the Board of Inquiry into Scientology, a 1965 report by the Australian government. After this, strange people were trying to break into Paulette's apartment, and Paulette found alligator clips on her phone wires. Remembered from the Manual of Justice that noisy investigation is an intimidation method. Paulette's cousin was in Paulette's apartment, alone, when the man came to deliver flowers. He pulled a gun on her, which failed to fire, choked her, and ran off. Police had no leads, and so could not pursue. Paulette moved to a building with a doorman after that incident. Soon after, 300 neighbors in the building received an anonymous smear letter, claiming that Paulette was a part-time prostitute, and had once sexually molested a 2-year-old girl. A few weeks later, in early 1973, FBI agent Bruce Brockman visited Paulette, and told her that James Meisler, a New York Scientology spokesman, claimed to have received an anonymous bomb threat, and Paulette was named by him as a suspect. A federal grand jury called Paulette to appear. Paulette had to put up a $5,000 retainer for a case that would ultimately cost her $28,000. Her attorney in the case would sue her afterwards for non-payment. Again, note that lawsuits are not there to resolve a dispute, but merely to harass. Prosecutor John Gordon III outlined that the penalty for the bomb threats was 5 years for each letter, plus 5 years, if she perjured herself, plus $15,000 in fines. After Paulette testified truthfully that she had never touched those letters, John asked, "Then how did your fingerprint get on one of them?" Paulette was indicted on 3 accounts, 2 for the bomb threats, and 1 for perjury for denying them. 10 days later, Paulette Cooper was arrested for the 3 convictions. She was released on her own recognizance, and prohibited from leaving the state. At this time, Paulette Cooper developed a drinking problem, smoked heavily and popped Valium like M&Msum. Paulette was also freaking out about her legal bills, about going to prison, about her career. Paulette's mental state had deteriorated, and her depression grew, to the point where her boyfriend left her and her friends had stopped calling. A friend, an editor in New York, stuck by her, talking her down from consuming Valium. Another loyal friend was Jerry Levin, who had moved in with her that summer. He used to tell her that you have to be brave if you're going to take on those bastards. In Paulette's own words, she was a shadow of her former adventurous self, and had even become suspicious of him. She eventually could no longer trust Jerry, and he walked out on her. As it turned out later, Jerry was a Scientologist, who was reporting Cooper's mental state to the church. Before the trial, Miss Cooper was interviewed by Dr. Roy Wallace, a Scottish University professor, who was writing a book on Scientology, and who had interviewed L. Ron Hubbard personally beforehand. Dr. Wallace revealed to Paulette Scientology's fair game rules, that an enemy of Scientology can be injured by any means by a Scientologist, including tricked, sued, lied to or destroyed. Paulette, despite having this evidence, was still to go to trial. Paulette sought a doctor to perform a truth serum test. She was 83 pounds in weight, and so most medical professionals avoided assisting her. Dr. David Caudon, a neurologist, administered the serum, and had become so convinced of Paulette's innocence, that he said he would chain himself to the courthouse, if they proceeded with the case. Upon seeing the expert advice of Dr. Caudon, the affidavit from Dr. Wallace, and information on fair game policies, the prosecutor filed a nolle prosequi, effectively canceling the trial, upon condition of Miss Cooper having psychotherapy for a year. Cooper's psychotherapy records were stolen, later on. 4 years later, the FBI raided 3 Scientology offices, and seized a vast number of internal memos, including information on Operation Freakout. This operation was the code name given to the project to have Paulette Cooper committed to a mental institution, or prison. Paulette Cooper went on to fight a variety of lawsuits against the church for the next decade, including a case against the framing of Cooper for the bomb threats. Charles Batdorf, a Scientologist, went to prison for refusing to testify. Interestingly, as is standard Scientology practice, the defense used was the First Amendment, citing their right to freedom of religion, almost implying that being a religion is a license to break the law. In 1981, Cooper initiated her own suit against Scientology, which concluded in 1985 with a settlement. As you can see, Miss Cooper spent a very large part of her life fighting the Church of Scientology over a book she wrote back in the early 1970s. What amazes me about this behavior is how totally without compassion or remorse the Scientologists are. I cannot even imagine doing something this hideous to someone. I cannot imagine it. Do you not feel empathy? Doesn't a so-called homo novus feel anything for other people? Can't you fight your critics with reasoned argument, or are you so vapid and answerless you must fight with lawsuits, threats, intimidation and cruelty? This is why we must win our struggle against these criminals. This is why this church must cease to exist. Because it is a parasite to its members, it is a threat to society at large, and it is a compassionless destroyer of lives. Scientology. We are anonymous. We are legion. We do not forgive. We do not forget. Expect us.